Most likely, you've heard a story that goes something like this. A woman who lived in a quiet medieval village was like any other. She made herbal remedies and also acted as a midwife. Perhaps she even helped educate women on sexuality, or she's secretly a peaceful pagan. Maybe she just had too many opinions. Now that's not allowed of a medieval peasant woman, right? So her neighbors bring accusations of her to the church. They claim she rides a broom to the devil's Sabbath, that she consorts carnally with demons, and practices arcane arts. This woman has no hope of salvation. She's unquestioningly sentenced as a witch and burned at the stake. Perhaps she was tested by her weight beforehand to see if she has a soul. Maybe not. Either way, millions of women like her fell victim to this madness, millions killed in what is now called the Burning Times. Sounds familiar, right? But this image we have isn't really true, nor remotely accurate. Millions of women weren't killed for being witches, and they usually weren't burned. Midwives weren't targeted either, and that story you've seen floating around TikTok recently about women putting ointments on broomsticks and using them for self-pleasuring isn't accurate either. So, what's up with all these myths? And how did we even get here? Happy belated Halloween! I wanted to still do a spooky topic, even though it's November now. Last year, of course, we dived into vampires, but this year, a different Halloween icon has been on my mind. Witches. With the rise of, well, TikTok armchair historians and such, it's been impossible for me to avoid the ever-growing onslaught of completely bonkers takes on historical witchcraft. Of course, many of these myths aren't remotely new. They simply grew over time and have been cemented in the cultural lexicon. But other myths have arisen in recent years through misinterpretation on social media, an issue that I discussed in my video on TikTok's historical misinformation and my ancient artifacts video. About a decade ago, I spent a lot of time lurking the online space known as Weckmueller, the community of Wiccans, neo-pagans, and modern witches who live on Tumblr. And that gave me a pretty solid idea not only of how witchcraft itself has evolved over time and continues to evolve, but just how strongly random myths from the 20th century have altered our ideas of the Middle Ages and historical witch hunts. Quick disclaimer, this video will be covering myths largely about Western European witchcraft history, as well as a little bit of American, because they inform each other. And we will be touching on, but not really getting into, modern witchcraft. I can only cover so much in one video. So come learn with me on a journey through some witchy myths and false facts. But first, let's hear a quick word from today's sponsor, Wayfair. As you already know, I am currently hosting season 2 of the series A Style is Born, brought to you by Wayfair. Wayfair has their own channel on YouTube where they have various shows talking about some fascinating histories of object and design. A Style is Born is a show where we explore the history behind some of the most iconic design styles. You may be familiar with season 1, which was hosted by Ariel Bissett, who did an amazing job and explored some super fascinating styles like mid-century modern, cottagecore, and boho. In this series, we peel back the layers of some of your favorite styles and see what fascinating history is hiding underneath, what influences evolved them, what their main elements are, and the social factors that you may not have realized were connected to them, as well as how they're being revived throughout recent decades through to today, so you can incorporate them into your own home if you so desire. You can go ahead and check out the first 4 episodes of season 2, where we explore Art Deco and Art Nouveau, 2 of my very favorite styles, and after that is the ever so chunky and controversial Brutalism, and the last episode covered Gothic style, just in time for Halloween. In this new episode, we give some love to nature lovers everywhere and explore the world of biophilic design, which seeks to merge our love of nature and our constructed environment. So come learn with me by following A Style is Born over on Wayfair's YouTube channel, which is linked in the description below. And now, let's get back to learning about historical witch hunts. Let's get one thing clear before you all explode in fury. Yes, thousands of people, men and women, were executed for supposed witchcraft over the course of nearly 1,000 years. But no, not the millions that people claim. And these people weren't actually persecuted for genuine witchcraft like many in the neo-witch community tend to claim. If they confessed to witchcraft, it was frequently after lots of brutal torture or psychological twisting to make them believe that what they had done was actually witchcraft. And unfortunately, a lot of the time the accusers themselves themselves were women, and weren't accusing midwives or healers, because actually quite a lot of midwives were the accusers themselves, or were helping the inquisitors to identify witch marks and things like that. What makes this such a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, and also why the myth of the helpless innocent witch or midwife being burned by men is so attractive, is because the truth is so much more complicated than the myth is. It's a lot less black and white. And the truth forces us to confront a lot more myths than just the one of the burning times. I think to address pretty much all historical witchcraft myths, we need to start way back at the bottom of the pyramid, the base level being the myths surrounding medieval paganism in general. I think when most folks think of witch trials, particularly in England, there's now a generally accepted image that comes to mind. Peasant women who followed an ancient remnant form of paganism despite the spread of Christianity, and therefore were considered witches or considered themselves witches, and were henceforth persecuted and killed by the church. And if you hang out on social media or near gothy or witchy circles long enough, you'll hear people giving you the impression that millions of women were killed after being accused of witchcraft, or just tens of thousands, which is closer to the truth. And this idea of a collective radical outsider womanhood during what people call the burning times has become an icon and mutually accepted background of a lot of occult-loving women and femme-aligned folks. Think of all those "we are the daughters of the witches you couldn't burn" shirts and mugs that you can find, well, everywhere. This idea can kind of be traced back to around 1968, when the group New York Radical Women named their action wing Witch, which was an acronym for a lot of different things. The group took hold of the idea of witchcraft as empowered, dangerous womanhood, and often incorporated spell work or witch costumes into their activism. They wrote, "They bowed to no man, being the living remnant of the oldest culture of all, one in which men and women were equal sharers in a truly cooperative society before the death-dealing sexual, economic, and spiritual oppression of the imperialist phallic society took over and began to destroy nature and human society." Which, of course, is just not what happened. Regardless, from then on, witches were permanently tied to radical feminism. Diane Purkis writes in The Witch in History, "Feminist histories of witchcraft are not finished artifacts, but stages in a complicated, conflictual series of processes within the public sphere. Processes which involve both the writing of women's past and the rewriting of their present and future. Since all feminist histories offer to ask, and sometimes answer, the question, 'What is a woman?' all feminist histories of witchcraft are caught up in contemporary questions of authority, authenticity, and public politics. The generalizing of 1,000 years of apparent persecution of witches has been flattened to ignore the complexities so that it looks like all of these cases have a commonality that can fit into the framework of the burning times, the attempt by modern witches to co-opt the language of the Holocaust. This is especially notorious in Mary Daly's book, Gynecology, among other writings, in which she conflates all misogynistic sexualized violence to witch hunting and perpetrates the myth of millions of burned women, conflates bad reviews of feminist books to Nazi book burnings, and tries to compare unsupported claims about witch hunting to other facets of the Holocaust. But Daly and other witchcraft historians tend to fall into these traps and more, taking it upon themselves to attempt to create a cohesive narrative on witchcraft using the Holocaust as a framework because they feel like that's the only way that people will take women's history seriously. Unfortunately, it is indeed very hard for people to take women's history seriously. In these attempts, they, along with various historians and anthropologists, often cite documents like the Malleus Maleficarum, which just so happens to actually target midwives in a way that almost no other text did. The Malleus, therefore, became a key point in witchcraft history, being tied to misogyny itself, due to it going on and on and on about women being witches and such, ignoring the fact that, in its own time, the Malleus Maleficarum wasn't actually taken that seriously by most people, but it, along with pop culture witchcraft of the last century, has still managed to inform a great deal of our ideas about how witchcraft was seen in the Middle Ages. The issue is, the very basis of a lot of these ideas is misguided or just wrong, and to understand that, we need to get a grip on the world of the Middle Ages and spirituality, which in itself seems like a space fairly foreign to modern religion. When you look at medieval art and manuscripts, manuscript, as well as sculpture work that adorns churches, it reads to the modern eye as, well, rather witchy and foreign. It doesn't make sense to us to see the Celtic green man and people showing off their genitals and strange references to rituals adorning churches, unless they're like secret hidden Easter eggs referring to pagan beliefs. Right? The last vestiges of Europe before Christianity clutched to the hearts of conservative peasantry. You can see these references to the Green Man and folkloric iconography everywhere, in particular in Welsh and Irish creations, including Arthurian tales like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a notably Christian series. The thing is, though, the Middle Ages in Britain were a lot less pagan than we've been led to believe, and the idea cropped up pretty much as soon as the era ended. Paganism as an accusation in religious disputes proved extremely useful, but was not usually grounded in reality. The fantasy of lurking paganism on the fringes of Christendom took hold in particular in the paranoias of 14th century demonology, which was very popular and gave birth to core texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, which was published in 1486 and was a text that was used to identify witches. The 14 to 1500s also saw some early recognizable drawings and descriptions of witches, like this image from Les Champions des Dames by Martin Lefranc, circa 1440, showing what may be the first image of a witch riding a broomstick, which we'll get into later. But as with most issues in the Middle Ages, a lot of the question of paganism itself actually led back to conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. Because the Protestants in particular kept looking at the notably more ritualistic Catholicism and going like, guys, I think they're doing a paganism over there. And that image just sorta bled out to cover the entire Middle Ages in the eyes of the generations that followed. Through the Reformation, Enlightenment, and the following eras, people looked back on the Middle Ages and thought that all that weird stuff going on certainly looked pretty witchy. But if you had asked anyone actually in the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have known what the hell you were talking about. It wasn't witchcraft, it was usually just their normal weird medieval shit. Over time, in particular after the Middle Ages, the idea of religious heretics being sorcerers evolved over literally centuries into the idea of the devil tricking weak-minded people into selling their souls in exchange for magical powers. Stuff like that. Although this era saw women as inherently more weak-minded and easily tricked by the devil, referencing the Adam and Eve story, male witches were not unheard of. In fact, we do have some incidents of men literally claiming to be sorcerers, especially in the 14th to 15th centuries. One trial involved 3 men convicted of attempting to use necromancy on the Pope. Another incident involved 4 men who claimed that they could cure King Charles VI of France of his illness using magic and invoking demons. So although it was believed that witchcraft was a predominantly female weakness, there were certainly male witches, and as a result, they were seen as inherently feminized. Not female or homosexual, but feminized. The construction of witches and witchcraft as not only an all-female but uniquely medieval phenomenon, as well as witch hunts as a cover for misogynist persecution, is a story created over centuries by an expansive web of historians. Andrew Gow writes in Male Witches in Early Modern Europe, "Meanings are made, not found." Roland Barthes has argued that creating meaning is the essence of what historians do. The historian is not so much a collector of facts as a collector and relator of signifiers. That is to say, he organizes them with the purpose of establishing positive meaning and filling the vacuum of pure, meaningless series. It is important, therefore, to be open about the kinds of assumptions and positions that inflict the meanings one creates. The very prevalence not only of male witches in history, but also the considerable agency that a lot of the actually existing self-proclaimed witches or magical practitioners had, honestly should raise a lot of questions about the quest to relate historical witchcraft to modern-day girl-boss feminism. But we all know how the story goes with historical revisionism, especially when the Victorians, get a hold of it. As I discussed in my video on the medieval aesthetic, the 19th century became very attached to a romantic image of the Middle Ages that only marginally had to do with the actual era. Because of this, a lot of 19th century artists and writers started getting super interested in paganism, witchcraft, folklore, and spirituality outside of Christianity. There was something enticing and romantic about the idea of ancient magic, and people really latched onto it. Like, for example, in Jules Michelet's book La Sorcière, published in 1862, which covered an extremely romanticized and not really accurate history of witchcraft. Books like this, in combination with the works of Victorian folklorists, cemented the idea that in the Middle Ages, the peasantry were clinging to ancient paganism under the guise of Christian practices, and therefore, anything in medieval relics and art that people deemed weird was immediately associated with pagans. It's sort of like, you know how whenever you have random tummy troubles and your doctor isn't sure what's up, so they just say it's IBS or stress and move on? It's like that. Oh, weird ancient or medieval thing that looks different from what we're used to seeing? Paganism. That's obviously not to say that no one was practicing paganism in the Middle Ages. That would be stupid. Especially outside of Western Europe. A great number of European countries and cultures remained pagan as late as the 17th century or later. But the thing is, the word pagan itself is not really a specific term. And what I'm mostly trying to address here is the idea of the Middle Ages that has infiltrated pop culture, one that does focus on Britain and France and those surrounding areas. Because naturally, that's the mental idea that we have to contend with now. That's the bias of tangible history, right? We can only prove what we know with what we actually have, with what has survived the ravaging forces of time. And surely the church did erase what it disagreed with. But the point is, there's a middle ground here, and unfortunately, the Middle Ages was a lot less pagan, and witch-hunty for that matter, than a lot of eager historians have been giving it credit for. Even the ever-common Green Man is an unreliable reference point for hidden medieval paganism. Francis Young writes, "The identification of this motif, which is almost ubiquitous in European churches built between the 11th and 16th centuries, as portraying the pagan Green Man, originated with the amateur anthropologist Julia Hamilton Somerset. Her 1939 article in the journal Folklore coined the term Green Man and essentially invented an ancient fertility cult surrounding him, one that supposedly persisted into the Middle Ages. The article appeared at a time of heightened interest in folklore, in British anthropology and letters, a trend begun by James Frazier's The Golden Bough, 1891, and continued by Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance, 1920, and other modernist studies, many of which misconstrued the mythological material in order to recover a coherent native pagan tradition. Somerset declared the Green Man's presence in churches proof that, quote, unofficial paganism subsisted side by side with the official religion of medieval Britain. Somerset's was, for decades, the definitive interpretation of the Green Man, influencing scholarly studies of the motif in folklore and medieval art and literature. More recently, architectural historians have acknowledged the speculative nature of her arguments. For centuries, scholars would slap the pagan label on anything that they didn't agree on or understand, and those ideas have naturally stuck around to this day because historians kind of don't have the answers and maybe never will. The other problem is the fact that, realistically speaking, pagan is not actually a seriously functional term. It gets used as an umbrella term to encompass any number of practices outside of Christianity, and these practices varied wildly by locale. The people doing these practices would not have identified as pagan back then, especially if they had been baptized and called themselves a Christian. What did those ancient practices and habits mean if you identified as a Christian? Honestly, not much. Christianity was practiced functionally in a diverse myriad of ways by medieval peasantry, and almost all of it was seen as valid. People started saints' cults, sacrificed livestock, created strange hybrid creature icons, and these were still considered Christian practices in these small rural communities. There wasn't a secret force of magical, mystical pagans lurking in secret, hiding their practices from the church, keeping traditions alive as resistance. That's an idea that literally the fucking Victorians came up with, as usual. So you see, a lot of the most iconic cornerstones of ancient and medieval paganism in places like Britain are fairly recent interpretations, and yes, that's what a lot of them are. Interpretations. This idea of creating something new and then attaching an ancient historical lineage to it applies to even more extreme cases too. Most infamously, with Wicca. Okay, Wiccans in the audience, I say this with love, but I know y'all like to tussle, so go ahead and go down to the comments and call me whatever nasty names you want, get it out of your system. It helps my engagement anyway. Okay? Y'all good? Awesome. Wicca is not an ancient religion. It was officially introduced in the 1950s by a British man named Gerald Gardner, but had roots in the previous few decades, with British folks trying to reconstruct a perceived historical paganism. Wicca's root basis hinges on the myth of the Burning Times and a single cohesive pagan spirituality that hid in secret under the tyranny of the church, which admittedly was tyranny, notably pushed by a certain Margaret Murray, who, as we have established, didn't know what the fuck she was talking about. Murray's ideas have since become ingrained in popular Wicca, like the idea of 13-member covens, or of witch priests, etc., and Gerald Gardner was a huge fan of Murray's work. To this day, a lot of Wiccans tend to wax poetic about the Burning Times, as if their great-great-great-great-great-grandma was a literal victim or something. A lot of the modern claims that various traditions in Christianity had pagan roots also sit in Wiccan folklorist claims, but in recent years those claims have been revisited by historians and found to not be true, unfortunately. Now, Gerald Gardner himself told everybody in the 30s that he got initiated into a witch's coven somewhere in Hampshire, and after that founded a coven with his wife at the country club that they owned. And Wicca essentially evolved there, at the country club. And Gardner's philosophies and teachings, I'm not gonna lie, were kinda whack in some respects. For instance, he was very homophobic and believed that men loved women by mastering them, and he was very adamant that no homosexual witches exist. That said, a lot of Wiccans feel no connection to Gardner, and the religion has evolved quite a bit over the last several decades. Neo-paganism in general is an ever-evolving thing and wildly complex, so it's impossible to make sweeping statements on any part of it. There's lots of good folks and lots of folks with issues, and I've run into many of both, personally. But the one overarching statement that we can make on Wicca as a whole is that no, it is not ancient. Sorry. There was no witch cult in the Middle Ages. Here's the thing though. The Middle Ages were also, honestly, a lot less scared of witches than we give them credit for. If you look at medieval trials and court documents, a lot of the time people accusing someone of witchcraft were called fools by the church, and sometimes even punished themselves instead. But odds are, if you were actually getting got by the church and sentenced, it was for perceived heresy, not necessarily witchcraft. And because it was so easy to have that accusation flipped on you if the person you were accusing got acquitted, it's not exactly a desirable thing for folks to be doing all willy-nilly. There were much easier ways to get revenge on that neighbor you hate than risking it in court, you know? And the other thing is, odds are you were not going to get burned at the stake either way. My fake history hunter has a whole chapter on the subject in her new book. She writes, even after the Middle Ages, when witch hunting reached its height, ironically the most barbaric witch hunts were in the Renaissance, the period of so-called rationality and enlightenment, in most cases witches were hanged, drowned, buried, or boiled alive, and so on. And in many cases, even if a witch was burned, they were first strangled. So much better than getting burned, I'm sure. So in the Reformation era, there was a lot of flip-flopping going on as people, amidst a society filled with fear and religious turmoil, struggled to figure out what a witch even was and what they could actually do. Men, too, were called witches. In fact, at first it was mostly men getting accused of witchcraft because they were more likely to read and could therefore be dabbling in arcane tomes. But then, of course, it flipped to accusing more women because original sin and lust and all that. Speaking of sin and lust, what's up with those flying ointments we keep hearing about on social media? There were indeed ointments in history with psychoactive properties, but at some point 600 years ago, theologians began to refer to a certain witch's ointment which was made of the flesh and blood of murdered children. I think it goes without saying that this was obviously made up, but the story kind of spiraled from there, and there were genuinely ointments that gave the illusion of flying, as there always have been, but they were not used in the way that would be described in the 70s by Michael Harrison in his book The Roots of Witchcraft and Michael Harner in Hallucinogens and Shamanism. In his book, Harrison writes, the ointments were taken percutaneously in a water solution or ointment raises an interesting suggestion in respect of the famous witch's broomstick. And sometime later, Harner writes in his own book, the use of a staff or broom was undoubtedly more than a symbolic Freudian act, serving as an applicator for the atropine-containing plant to the sensitive vaginal membranes, as well as providing the suggestion of riding on a steed, a typical illusion of the witch's ride to the Sabbat. Allegedly, these claims go back to Giordano de Bergamo's Inquiry into Witches from 1465, but if you go back to the literal quote from that, it doesn't actually refer to the witches doing anything necessarily sexual with the ointment and brooms. In fact, no historical document which mentions witches' brooms or any other tool ever refers to them being used for sexual purposes. The myth was further pushed in Enemy of the Channel Margaret Murray's book on the witch cult of Western Europe, a book notoriously full of misinformation and lies, and since has been the source of a huge number of pervasive myths. But you can see why the folks of the groovy 60s and 70s, fresh into their acceptance of girl boss witchcraft and drugs, and the Burning Time story, would be so excited to hear about psychedelic flying ointments that medieval women apparently used to jerk off. Again, confirmation bias. But I'm sorry to tell you, it's just not true. And the concept of a witch's ointment itself is just as fantastical as the fearful stories of the witch's Sabbath itself, in which witches flew to meet the devil, have sloppy demonic sex, and plot to overthrow Christendom. Just an average Friday night. It really should go without saying that all of that just wasn't happening. But psychoactive ointments did exist at this time. They just weren't considered witchcraft. They were seen as perfectly normal. Imagine getting accused of witchcraft because you gave your friend a Benadryl and they saw the Hat Man. That would be ridiculous, right? It's literally the same deal. I know that that was all a lot, so let's recap. Paganism in the Middle Ages wasn't one cohesive witch cult. The Burning Times myth contains loads of misinformation and is a mischaracterization of a millennium of capital punishment and fundamentally misunderstands the complexities of witch hunting. Accused witches were both men and women and weren't really the humble midwives or sexually liberated women we imagine, secretly pagan or not. The Middle Ages had a lot more diversity in Christian and secular spiritual practice than we think. There was no such thing as witches' ointments. People really didn't actually get accused or convicted of witchcraft that frequently in the first place, and if they were, odds are they weren't even burned at the stake. And just to throw another small little myth in here, the Catch-22 test of seeing if someone drowns to see if they're a witch is inaccurate also. If the person floated, okay, they're a witch. Means they don't have a soul, so they weigh less. But if they sank, then they would actually be rescued and presumed innocent. There you go. And this test wasn't even used that often in the first place. Anyway, it's of course all fun and games to make memes about like, oh, my music taste or my outfit or my behavior, yada yada, would get me burned at the stake for witchcraft in the Middle Ages. Not really. Usually. To be honest, the Renaissance was more severe if you're going there. But the Middle Ages weren't nearly as fearful, small-minded, and uncritical as we've been led to believe for one reason or another. The Middle Ages had its own issues, but we need to stop using myths about it as a reference point to use for modern political or social goals to make ourselves look better. It just doesn't hold up. Of course, there have always been pagans in some form, because historically that word doesn't mean anything specific. There have always been people interested in witchcraft. People were indeed killed after being accused of witchcraft. The church was unhinged, and still is. And people have always been sexually freaky, even though that doesn't have anything to do with witches' broomsticks. There are beads of truth sewn throughout this story, but how they've been strung together is where the problem lies. In the end, what do we make of all this? The history and historiography of witchcraft and witch hunts is a prime example of the myth of progress. We are not now, nor have ever been, smarter collectively than people of the past. All we have is the privilege of gained collective knowledge and resources, but a key factor in our own folly is history and the mismanaging of history itself. Andrew Gow continues, historians not only study the past, we also make it. Much of what we think about witches comes from the above-mentioned traditions of Enlightenment and Romantic scholarship. To both camps, the witch provided a useful test case, a means to prove a broader set of ideas and values using an unquestionably important phase in the common Western past. If pre-Enlightenment Europeans were so fatally wrong about the existence of witches, then the rest of their worldview must also be suspected of the worst inconsistencies, irrationalities, and errors. The project of Enlightenment was to prove just that, to depict an irrational ancient regime, so decayed, so perverse and dangerous, especially to the powerless and the marginal, that only a new and rational worldview could possibly replace it. Medieval witch hunts are used constantly ever since the era ended as a prime example of look how stupid people were back then, and look how smart and progressed we are now. But when you really look at it, here's what becomes clear. We are now, and have always been, exactly the same. People in the Middle Ages were a lot smarter and more rational than we give them credit for, and we today are a lot fucking stupider than we want to admit. Today, literally right now, millions upon millions of people are sitting on social media and falling tail first into every bit of propaganda that comes across their feed. Well, because it confirms their pre-existing biases. You are not immune to this. I am not immune to this. Every single day, people sit by and allow or enable atrocities to happen, and not think anything is wrong. How is that different from ye olden witch hunts? The truth is, it isn't. You can be the most critical person alive, and you will still fall for some sort of bullshit, because it happens to everyone. So, what can we do? Now, in the face of dangers like AI and deep faking, and the toils of the internet making the fight so much harder, it's hard to say. Just do your best and stay vigilant. Hold on to compassion, and don't let yourself become a tool of persecution and genocide. Thank you for learning with me about a very persistent series of myths. Did y'all do anything fun for Halloween? My cat just got spayed, so I've been in hell trying to take care of a problematic patient. She's not making it easy for me, but she's just a baby. She has an excuse, I guess. Anyway, until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and live deliciously.